I was thinking today I could say some things about the schizoid position. It's come up a bit, and and it really deserves attention because in our public dialogue about mental health and neurodiversity, this seems to be rather neglected. There are tropes, and within those tropes, there's really quite a few different presentations that we might see of an individual that is fundamentally schizoid in his or her orientation to others in the world around them and, the internal world of emotions. But specifically because these individuals often feel depersonalized in some cases, or not only misunderstood, but as if there's not really a way of being understood. It really deserves some attention. So I'm going to talk about that today. So the notion of schizoid, right? It means there's a split. And if we can imagine the life path of a human being coming into the world where there are others there that can know us and meet our needs and be responsive to us, and then there's also the experience of not having that met, of that not even happening on a pre-verbal level. You have two very different ways of orienting to the world. And so for the part of self, for the element of one's life experience that's just not connected, not being connected with, not being recognized, or in some cases being encroached upon by in a way that's very much unresponsive to the inner world and the inner needs of a sensitive young life, there's kind of a shutting down there. And in response to this, the rest of the self that, let's say in cases where it's not so extreme, that's just all that remains, this hermit or this affectless, disconnected individual who has little interest in social or sexual or romantic intimacy. When there is a breakthrough and a part of the self does realize that it's nice to be seen, it's nice to be known, but yet there's also this experience living inside that's, I guess, in this wonderful songbook, I'm not quite sure if this is Elton John's or the songwriter's experience of being a rocket man, but one can feel very much in the world, but really a part of it. Maybe even in some ways it just seemed to stick out. So Theodore Millon, who's really influential, and I like the way that his work seems to take personality subtypes, structures of defensive shapes of how we are a human being in the world that's managing these various tensions, conflicts, insecurities, fears, needs. How these subtypes of personality, which sometimes manifest in full-blown personality disorders, but not always, sometimes as neuroses, sometimes even as styles of personality, how those manifest in what was formerly referred to as the Axis 1 diagnoses, things that people come in complaining about. Theodore Millon mentioned 4 specific subtypes, one of which is sort of without emotion. Someone that can show up and not really be connected or want to be really engaged, and they seem fine with that. This is a little more classical schizoid, what we think of when we learn about it in school. And there may be some questions, is autism spectrum? And, well, if there are many other things happening, then yes, it could be, but it also could just be the way that a person is built psychologically and not really having as much to do with the world being so overwhelming as to require this type of a shutdown. course, not all people on the autism spectrum really seem shut down at all. Sometimes quite the opposite. Then there's also I believe it's the withdrawn. So, those who seek solace in nature, or by pulling out of the world. This is sort of a combination of what we call schizotypal and avoidant sorts of flavors to the schizoid position. And there may be some interesting ways of relating to life and to reality. And I don't know, actually, I think there happens to be quite a lot of productive and interesting speculation by individuals that relate in this way to the world. But what about that underlying conflict? How might their observations also lack insight into their own natures? And it's not really the best person to follow that's disconnected from aspects of humanity that the rest of us may need. But still, it's an interesting subtype. There's also the languid, which is depressed, walking around, not knowing who to connect with, feeling sad, motivationless. And then there's the dissociative, feeling as if one is not living one's own life, not connected to the body or the self or the personality or others. These two can go together. Any of them can blend together, and there are likely many other subtypes. But what I'd like to get into is a bit of the etiology, because it helps to understand this. And the notion, whether you have a more sort of classical orientation to schizoid that places some of the early deprivation in this phase of life prior to really forming much of a symbiotic connection with the caregiver, or as others, in Masterson's school have proposed, it can occur as late into life as rapprochement, which is, having more to do with pushing away the caregiver and then needing to somehow integrate a relationship and that being frustrated. So ultimately there's a lack of confidence, whether it's earlier or later in this first few years of life, that one's cries and one's needs will be responded to. And then an orientation to the object, that which is seen as capable of responding to those needs in a way that it's seen as something that might be damaged by one's need. This is where it crosses over a little bit into some of the later phases, such as the avoidant individuals that seem to want to take care of everyone else because they aren't, they have too much shame for their own needs or their own pain, and seem to focus outward. Well, with the schizoid, it's not, there may not even be that type of a drive to do that. And there's a need for the connection, and there's also a need to be protected from the crushing disappointment and the sense of deep shutting down from it not being met. And so you can see there's a lot of conflict here, and often there's a compromise that results. This in and out program of seeking closeness, but then also perhaps making compromises to be dominated by the other, or losing interest. So one thing that I think is interesting that isn't always useful when discussing this is the notion of a split between a libidinal and an anti-libidinal self. Anti-libidinal simply means withdrawn from life. So let's say you have someone that's really not being noticed, or really being impinged upon, or even perhaps due to other circumstances, maybe an incubator after birth that just doesn't have what's needed in order to feel like that libidinal relationship to life, of having one's needs met, of being alive is where it's just not possible. Well, there's a shutting down there. And that's where a part of the person's life energies might rest. Again, the bottom of the sea, like in the blackness of night. And it sounds nice a little bit, but it's nice if one isn't collapsed and folded from there being no other option. It's such a dependent and sensitive developmental period to be traumatized by that. So a part of self lives distanced from the world, almost like in the end of the film, Being John Malkovich, which I think is interesting that there's a person living, watching, or a Get Out is perhaps even a better metaphor, where someone is just sat there watching someone else living their life, trapped, scared, alone, maybe resentful. Often there's a discussion of terror and hatred, a sense of being hated, and also having that hatred coming from the part of self that's so deeply deprived and split off. And this blending of watching the world through those eyes and not being seen or recognized. So this split between something that's virtually folded and then the natural need that also then progresses alongside of it to engage in the world. This leads a person to feel somewhat different, like a war veteran with PTSD might feel different at a social event where their fears and their triggers are going off and everyone else seems to be enjoying the party just fine. Also, let's say that this happens, developmentally in the context of, elementary or middle or high school, where other people don't seem to be struggling with this sort of in and out program in the same way. And so then there's an additional split between the self and it. It feels like here are these needs for this, and then here are these needs for that. And so talk about a complex position to be in the world, and one that may not be very well reflected in our social discourse. We can understand if someone has PTSD, if someone may be on the autism spectrum, if we're willing to educate ourselves, and that person is able to socialize and learn more about it, engage in spectrum pride. What about the hermit pride? I've never heard of that. What about having so much to talk about, but you know that talking about it will just result in feeling estranged? This is the Schizoid Position. One of my favorite books in graduate school is The Divided Self by R.D. Laing. And he talks about this sort of conflict where someone is afraid of being turned into an object by others, so therefore one turns oneself into an object and therefore turns others and objects to it. You can see the connection to Martin Buber's notion of I and thou versus I and it, or I and you and I and it. Perhaps a better way of describing the relationship to others is whole people and objects. Laing relies on Kafka and his stories to really elucidate what this might look like and how bizarre it might be, what an existential position it is to be in. It doesn't always have to look like that. You don't have to be a cockroach in Metamorphosis to be estranged and with your struggles deeply disconnected with your engagement with the world. But sometimes these extreme examples are validating. And so I guess the reason I take such a serious tone with this is from a position of compassion and a real desire to describe what so many people may be experiencing And like I say, that abysmal place that feels so unmet, so unseen. Really deserves to be known by some others. And I would say even to be normalized. This is more common than is sometimes thought. According to some authors, it's only after some years that the therapist will discover a schizoid sort of dynamic with the client that otherwise might be struggling in other ways in life. And it can easily be brought into a notion of something a bit more popular that really doesn't capture it. So I will leave it there for now. But this will be a topic that I'm sure we'll pick up later. And it's not a condition that is something that is just set in stone. Of course, there's so many different individuals who struggle in different ways with different motivations. But I think that it is possible to pierce into it, but it might require really overcoming some hurdles, hurdles of intimacy, hurdles of being seen, hurdles of even understanding what's causing this to feel so different from what I see around me in the world. So hopefully this is a bit of a leg up, at least one of those areas.